So the first thing I have here is I just have a setup function that creates a canvas that's 900 wide and 500 tall. And then I made its background like a little bit gray so you can just kind of see where the canvas is. It's just this whole thing right here. The only reason this works is because inside this little plus sign, I put the P5 library right there. If you don't have that, this won't work. But if you do have it, it will. Now what we're going to do right here is we're going to make a checkerboard. And so to make a checkerboard, I need to do two things. I need rows and columns. So I'm going to make a variable to hold the number of rows, and I'm going to start at 0. You could also start at 1. It doesn't really matter. You're just trying to put the number of rows and the number of columns here. Are you cool with that so far? That makes sense? So we technically want how many rows? How many rows do you want to have?
2.
You want 2 rows? More? How many more? It's up to you. You can have your checkerboard have as many rows and columns as you want. Well, let's look at the lab and see what it says. Is it 12? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, something like that? 8? So let's go with 8 columns and 8 rows. That sound good? You guys cool with that? 8 columns, 8 rows. So I want to get rows all the way up to 8. Okay? So I will say, or columns all the way up to 8. So I will say while, and I'm going to put something inside that while loop right there. And I'm going to say as long as the columns are less than 8, we'll say columns equal columns plus 1. And then right here we'll say it was while columns is less than 8. Now why did I do it like that? The only reason I did it like that is because I want to count up from 0 to 8. And every time I count up one, I want to make a new column. And so to make a new column, I'm going to use the rectangle command. I'm going to say rect. And I'm going to put it at the position of whatever the columns are times 50. 50, 50, 50. Just like that. And what that'll do is it'll make 8 columns for me. Do you see that? Let's actually put this at 0 just to make it easier to see. So it's at the top. So did you see what happened right there? All that happened is I started with the variable columns at 0. And then I said as long as that variable has a number that's less than 0, or less than 8, excuse me, I want you to make a rectangle where you multiply that number times 50, so it keeps moving it to the right, and you make it start at 0, the height, and be 50 wide and 50 tall, and then we just add 1 to columns. So the first time this loop runs, columns is 0, then it's 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6, then 7, then 8. And each time it'll make a new square right here. Does that make sense? Or do you want me to stop and explain any part of this? Now the next thing I want to do is I want to add more rows, right? So I only have 1 row right here. I need some more rows. So I'm going to put another while loop inside this while loop. You cool with that? So we're going to make another while loop here. We're going to say while false. Oops. While false. So that does nothing so far. But what I want to actually happen is that I want to make a new row each time. So do the same thing. Add 1 to rows and say as long as rows is less than 8 too. Do the exact same thing. And so for each one of these, I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to put rows times 50. And if I do this little section right here, and I put it inside this whole thing, like this, what's happening here is rows is starting at 0, and while the rows is less than 8, it's going to make 8 different columns, and it's going to add 1 to rows. Are you cool with that part so far, or do you want me to explain anything that's happening here up to this point? You cool with this? You okay? So this is just 2 loops. one to make the number of rows, which I haven't finished yet, and one to make the number of columns. Would anyone like to explain that part? No? You okay with this so far? Yes? No? Maybe? Cool. Now what we want to happen is that each time this runs, we want to reset this whole thing. So we want to make sure this var columns equals 0 is inside here, so that it resets it to 0 each time, and it makes a little grid for us. So now we have a grid of 8 by 8 of all squares by starting at 0 and counting up to the number 8. So we start at 0, we count up to 8, and for each time we run this loop, we make a row of squares. And each time we run this one right here, or each time we run this loop, we make another row, like this, row, row, row. And each time we run this loop, we make 8 columns in that row. So doing that will give you a square that looks like this. Now to make them black or white, your job is to create 2 variables, var first color, I'm going to put it equal to black, var second color is equal to white. And you just want to check each time if that rows or column number is even or odd. And if the rows number is even, you can keep them black and white. If the rows number is odd, you want to switch them. So to check if a number is even or odd, you just divide it by 2 and check if it has a remainder. So you do it like this. You would say if rows modulus 2, which means if you divide rows by 2 and you get 0, that means the number is even. If that's true, then do this. Otherwise, don't. And you'll see if I do that, it only makes every other row, because it's only checking to see if they're even or odd. So then you just come in here and you say fill, or you say first color is equal to white, and second color is equal to black, or whatever you want to do, and then you switch it up every other time. So you just switch the colors depending on if the row is even or odd. And then over here you check to see if each column is even or odd, and you just fill them in. So if the cols modulus 2 is equal to 0, that means the column is even, and so you want to fill it the first color. Otherwise, we fill it the second color. And if you do that, you get a checkerboard. So we're just checking for even or odd numbers, and we're looping up to the number 8 each time. And if you do that, you get a pattern that looks exactly like a checkerboard. That's how you make a grid. That's how you do like a little bit of logic to get exactly what you want. Now this part's kind of confusing if you see it the first time, but if you follow along this video and type it out yourself, it'll make a little more sense. Is that cool? So I would say give it a shot, see how you do. Try the other mini challenges too, because they follow like the same kind of idea. Is that cool? Amazing. Fantastical.